Good morning and welcome back to the Morning Endurance Call. I'm Keith Erwood and this is your 15-minute or less leadership ritual for business owners, executives, and preparedness professionals who want to build stronger businesses, think more clearly under pressure, and lead with clarity in uncertain times. Today's topic is this: why discipline beats intention in preparedness. This matters because many businesses have good intentions around preparedness. They intend to review the plan, they intend to update key contacts, they intend to validate recovery assumptions, they intend to run an exercise, they intend to improve communications readiness, and they intend to strengthen leadership response, and they intend to revisit critical dependencies, and they intend to take preparedness more seriously. And these intentions may be sincere, but intention by itself does not create readiness. Because in business preparedness, the gap between what leaders mean and what the organization has actually done can become very expensive when disruption hits. And that is why discipline matters so much. This is one of the reasons why I'll say preparedness is not built by what you plan to do someday. It is built by what you do repeatedly and deliberately before the disruption arrives. That is the distinction. Because good intentions are common. Discipline is less common. Most organizations do not fail to prepare because they oppose preparedness in principle. They fail because preparedness competes with everything else. Daily disruptions take over. Urgent issues crowd out the important ones. Revenue pressure dominates attention. Projects expand. Meetings fill the calendar. And people assume there'll be more time later. And while that happens, preparedness becomes something that everyone wants to work on, but not enough to sustain with consistency. And that is where discipline becomes the differentiator. Because discipline is what turns preparedness from a good idea into operating reality. Let's make this a little more practical. What do I mean by discipline in this context? I mean repeatable, structured follow-through. Not dramatic effort once in a while. Not a sudden burst of activity after a recent scare. Not a single project that gets attention and then fades. I mean a pattern, a rhythm. The kind of discipline that says, we review this regularly, we test periodically, and we challenge assumptions intentionally. We keep key information current, we train people, we exercise leadership, and we improve what we learn. We do not leave preparedness to memory, mood, or convenience. That is discipline. And that is why it matters more than intention. Because intention says, we know this is important, but discipline says, we act on it consistently enough to make it real. That is a very different standard. Now, why is this so important in preparedness specifically? Because preparedness is one of the areas where the absence of discipline is often hidden until the business is tested. A missed exercise today may not feel costly today. An outdated contact list may not feel urgent today. An unvalidated recovery assumption may not feel dangerous today. An unreviewed crisis plan may not feel like a problem today. But when a disruption happens, those small gaps can become real consequences very quickly. That is why preparedness rewards disciplined organizations and exposes the inconsistent ones. Preparedness is not forgiving of neglect that has had time to accumulate quietly, and that is why discipline matters. Let's talk about some of the places where intention often loses to discipline. First, one many will recognize is plan maintenance. A lot of businesses intend to keep plans current, but unless there is a disciplined review process, plans drift. Names and personnel changes, vendors change, systems change, roles change, assumptions change, and of course the business changes. And if the plan does not change with it, confidence starts to separate from reality. Second, testing and exercising. Most organizations intend to test more than they do. They know it matters. They talk about it. They may even schedule it. But without discipline, testing gets delayed, softened, postponed, and even skipped over. And the organization stays more dependent on assumption than on evidence. Third, leadership readiness. Many leaders intend to perform well, especially under pressure and during disruptions. But leadership under pressure is not built by intention alone. It is strengthened through discussion, scenario thinking, role clarity, decision practice, and repeated exposure to disciplined preparedness conversations. Without that rhythm, leadership often ends up relying too heavily on improvisation. And fourth, communications readiness. Most businesses intend to communicate well in a disruption, but good communication during disruption and under pressure usually reflects preparation before the event. Clear ownership, audience awareness, timing expectations, approval paths, message discipline, and shared leadership understanding. That does not happen well from intention alone. And fifth, follow through on lessons learned. This is a big one. A business may run an exercise, have trainings, experience an outage, and conduct an after-action discussion. People identify the gaps, everyone agrees on what should improve, and then what happens? Oftentimes, nothing, or very little. Maybe just enough to say the issue was discussed. That is where discipline becomes really important. Because learning only strengthens preparedness when the organization has the discipline to turn lessons into action. Now, I want to make an important point. Discipline does not mean perfection. It does not mean every review is flawless. It does not mean every exercise is complex, and it does not mean every gap gets fixed immediately. What it does mean is that the organization has enough maturity to keep moving preparedness work forward on purpose. That's what matters. Because some leaders hear the word discipline and imagine something rigid, heavy, and oftentimes overly burdensome. That is not what I mean. What I mean is reliability, I mean consistency, and I mean that preparedness is not left entirely to chance. In fact, disciplined preparedness often reduces burden over time. Why is that? Because it prevents the buildup of neglected weaknesses. It reduces last-minute scrambling, and it creates familiarity. It keeps capabilities current, and it helps the business operate with more confidence and less avoidable surprise. That is the practical value. Now, one of the reasons discipline beats intention is because disruption does not care how sincere your intentions were. A disruption does not pause and say, well, they meant to review that. They were planning to test it next quarter. They knew it needed improvement, and they were going to update that after a busy month. The event interacts with reality, not intention. That is why preparedness must be built into reality. This also means discipline is one of the clearest signals of seriousness in leadership. Leaders show what they truly value not only by what they say matters, but what they create the rhythm around. If preparedness is consistently deferred and people don't show up, it is usually not yet being treated with seriousness required. That is not a moral judgment, it is a leadership observation, because rhythm reveals priority and priority reveals culture. Now let's talk about what disciplined preparedness can look like in practice. It can look like a quarterly review, a scheduled leadership tabletop, a defined ownership structure, a recurring update process for contact information, an annual review of critical functions and dependencies, a regular check on recovery assumptions, a communications drill, a post-incident improvement cycle, a standing expectation that preparedness is discussed as part of leadership's responsibility. It does not always need to be dramatic, but it does need to be real. And that is where many businesses gain a real advantage. They do not try to become perfectly prepared overnight. Excuse me. They simply become more disciplined than they were before. That compounds over time. And this connects closely to business continuity, IT disaster recovery, crisis management, testing, exercising, training, and leadership readiness. All of those areas improve when they are supported by discipline. A good intention to test is not the same thing as a testing rhythm. A good intention to improve crisis communication is not the same as an owned communications process. A good intention to strengthen continuity is not the same as regularly challenging assumptions and updating capabilities. That is why discipline is so foundational. And it connects It connects directly to endurance, because endurance in business is the ability to continue operating, make sound decisions, recover intelligently, and keep moving forward under pressure over time. Wow, I'm struggling today. Discipline supports endurance because it turns preparedness into something repeatable, current, and usable. An enduring business is not built only on ambition, good ideas, or noble intentions. It is built on disciplined action repeated over time. That is true in preparedness, that is true in leadership, and it is true in business more broadly. Enduring businesses do not merely care about readiness. They create routines that strengthen readiness. That is what makes the difference. Now here's a very practical leadership question. What part of your preparedness effort currently depends too much on good intention and not enough on disciplined follow-through? You can also ask, what do we keep saying matters but have not yet turned into a rhythm? Where are we relying on memory instead of process? What preparedness work gets postponed most easily? And have we confused awareness with discipline? What recurring action would strengthen our readiness most if we simply did it consistently? And those are strong questions, because they move the conversation from aspiration into action. And that is where preparedness becomes more real. So here's today's leadership takeaway. Discipline beats intention in preparedness because readiness is not created by what leaders mean to do. It is created by the repeatable actions, reviews, tests, updates, and leadership habits that make preparedness real before disruption arrives. That is the distinction. Here's today's question for you. If your business was tested tomorrow, where would you be relying on disciplined preparedness, and where would you be relying mostly on good intentions? Because the answer often points directly to the next area where leadership can strengthen the business in a very practical way. Thank you for joining me today on the Morning Endurance Call. Tomorrow, I'm going to talk about the endurance mindset and how to lead through uncertainty. Until then, think clearly, prepare deliberately, and lead with endurance.